Today's author is Bryn Nilsson. He is an award-winning science writer and former microbiologist who received his doctorate from the University of Washington. Nilsson has accumulated more than 2 decades of journalism experience, including 7 years at Newsday. He is the author of Flesh and editor of 2 chapters for the best-selling 6-volume Modernist Cuisine. I'm not sure if those two seem to go together or not.
Yeah, I'll explain.
Okay. So Nilsson has written for dozens of other outlets, including the New York Times, Scientific American, The Daily Beast, CNN.com, and Wired. He will be presenting Poop Ecosystems, how bison patties, elephant dung, and other natural whatevers.
Great.
So,
yes, nutrients.
It's not on here.
Oh, okay.
Nutrients. So,
Recycling.
thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Right. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And so just to explain the connection, first of all, between the modernist cuisine, my 2 chapters were on how not to poison people with microbes. So that is, so basically food safety, I was kind of the Debbie Downer of the cookbook series. But I am a microbiologist by training. I've been a journalist for 20 years. And this book kind of grew out of an obsession of mine. So I have an affinity for the gut microbiome, and did basically a feature story on how you can transplant your microbiome from one person to another to cure them from a bacterial infection. And that sort of got me down this path. And so this book, to me, was really fun because I kept learning new things that made me excited and kind of turned what I thought I knew on its head. And so hopefully we will have fun this afternoon, and you might come away with a new appreciation for something that you thought you knew or didn't really want to know that much about. But I'm going to start us off just reading a little bit from the book because I think it sort of sets up today's talk really well. So, Flesh. So this is from the start of the book. Imagine that you're a giant, short-faced bear living in North America about 20,000 years ago. You would be massive, reaching roughly 10 feet in height when standing on your hind legs. No small feat considering that you'd weigh more than a ton. Although paleontologists haven't fully reconstructed your regular diet, you would likely be an omnivore and devour leafy greens and the carcasses of large animals. And when you pooped in the woods, well, that's where things get interesting. Giant, short-faced bears, like the continent's more carnivorous American lions, dire wolves, and saber-toothed cats, were the apex predators in a complex food web during the Pleistocene epoch. An exotic menagerie of lumbering plant eaters provided a diverse source of prey. Western camels and large-headed llamas, long-horned bison, and stag moose with their massive antlers. Harlan's ground sloths that rivaled the bears in size. Vulnerable young of the Columbian mammoths that towered above them all and swung their curving tusks across most of the continent. These colossal beasts had diets to match, and their digestive systems transformed the masses of vegetation they consumed into vast piles of manure. When they were eaten themselves, their fats and proteins and other nutrients sustained the lions and wolves and cats. Giant, short-faced bears likely sniffed out half-eaten carcasses and helped themselves to the rest, leaving their own scat littered across the landscape. Plants and trees grew in the fertilized patches. New grazers appeared, and the cycle repeated. Some 20,000 years later, the process looks rather different for the planet's second most prolific poopers. That's us. Anyone want to guess what the number 1 most prolific pooper on the planet?
Cows.
Cows. Cows, yep. So I'm going to flip the page. Many of us send our own output hurtling through a miles-long odyssey through the toilet into a complicated sewer network that connects to a wastewater treatment plant. We screen, filter, and aerate the incoming sewage, digest it with microbes, treat it with chlorine or other disinfectants, and pump the effluent through more pipes until it just discharges into a nearby lake or river or sea. We extract the solids and haul much of them off by trucks or trains to be burned in incinerators or buried in landfills. Modern sanitation is a luxury for much of the world. With a simple flush, our poop disappears. But have you ever wondered what exactly is swirling down the drain? Unlike bears or whales or birds, we expend an inordinate amount of time and effort to sequester our products from the rest of the natural world. And in doing so, we're effectively wasting one of the planet's most versatile natural resources. Now, I know what you're thinking. Seriously? Poop? Yes, yes. The object of disgust, the butt of jokes, the rump of puns. Sorry. And a dangerous substance to boot. It is far more than meets the eye, or the nose. To understand what we're missing out on, though, we need to know why we should care about it, how we make it, what it contains, and particularly instructive example of why we should give a crap about crap dates back to the heydays of the Pleistocene. So as rocks slowly weather and erode, they release phosphorus into soil. So phosphorus is an essential nutrient for life. Where plant roots can absorb it. Plants use the element, one of the 14 soil-derived nutrients that they require, 15 if you include cobalt, to produce and store energy from the sun, and to construct DNA, RNA, and cell membranes. Animals get phosphorus from eating plants, and use it to store energy as well, and to make DNA, RNA, membranes, teeth, bones, and shells, for the animals who have shells. Phosphorus, in other words, is essential for life. To increase its availability, we've learned how to mine it and add it to fertilizers. But phosphorus leaches into soils, washes into streams and rivers, and eventually sweeps into the ocean, where it sinks to the bottom and gradually accumulates in sediments. And that presents a big problem. We've already tapped most of the accessible deposits and don't have thousands of years to wait for geological upshifting from the ocean floor to expose more phosphorus-rich rocks. So how can the element be redistributed to help replenish soils? Chris Dowdy is an Earth system scientist who views our planet as one integrated system. In particular, he studies how large-scale ecological patterns, such as nutrient cycles, are influenced not only by wind, water, and plants, but also by animals. That means he spends a lot of time modeling and calculating how animals help complete the cycling of elements like phosphorus. After taking in nutrients over a lifetime, a bear or a whale or an elephant can return them to other living things when it dies and its body decomposes. But to Dowdy's surprise, his research has suggested that a much more important contributor, by several orders of magnitude, is the periodic release of nutrient-rich bundles in the form of animal dung. That makes sense when you consider how long and how far the producers can roam. For broad distribution by both aquatic and terrestrial fauna, Dowdy determined the bigger the better. Big animals move more than small animals, they're key, he told me. That's because bigger animals are more likely to move into an area with limited nutrients. Focusing on Pleistocene megafauna weighing at least 97 pounds, Dowdy and his colleagues developed a model that suggested that they were the key players in a complex phosphorus transport chain that moved the element from the deep ocean back up to the vast interior of continents. Whales carried phosphorus from the depths, and upon surfacing to catch their breath, dispersed it in the shallows and across the surface through plumes of floating fecal slurry. Not a fun phrase, but whale poop floats. That's key to this. Vast flocks of seabirds and schools of migratory fish, such as salmon, ferried the nutrient to the shore and up rivers and streams. And a succession of carnivores and herbivores completed the relay to forests and plains, mountains, and meadows. The complex predator-prey interactions created what Dowdy and other scientists call landscapes of fear, where carnivores relentlessly stalking herbivores kept both of them on the move. That has a huge impact on where they poop and on how the elements are incorporated into the ecosystem, he explained. Over time, the animals redispersed phosphorus. Sorry, flip the page. Fairly evenly across the landscape. These regular deposits in turn left behind extensive trails of food for other. Poop, in other words, helped make the living world go round. It still does. Filter feeding whales in Antarctic waters can convert iron-rich krill, or krill basically tiny shrimp, into bright orange feces that fertilize the surface for iron-dependent phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is a microscopic algae that feeds a vast array of sea creatures. On the sun-baked African savanna, elephants can disperse seeds up to 40 miles from a parent plant and nearly double the amount of soil carbon through their dung, thereby enriching a common grass that feeds other herbivores like gazelles. In North America, research by Canadian ecologist Wes Olson suggests that microbes taken in by a bison's snuffling nose or mouth help break down the cellulose in grass, while each resulting pile of dung can support more than 100 insect species. In Beloved Beasts, science journalist Michelle Nijhuis, who is here in the audience and will be talking the next session, so come to her session for more all about bison. She describes the profound impact of this bison patty ecosystem and bison snot ecosystem on prairies. Yes, it's true. When bison abounded, the clouds of insects in turn fed a community of birds and small mammals. Quote, without them, without bison snot, bison crap, and everything in between, the prairie is a smaller and quieter place, she writes. It's no wonder that some researchers call these kinds of habitat-creating animals ecosystem engineers. So that's from the book, just to set that up. And so hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense how a vast array of animals create ecosystems around them. Not just through the cycles of predator and prey, not just when they die and decompose, but also throughout their lives. And so another example of this is a series of caves in southern Arizona. It's called Kartchner Caverns. So any of you who have been lucky to visit it, it's a spectacular series of caves, and it's a living cave. So there's a very high humidity and a very specific range of temperatures. And that attracts bats, in particular the common cave bat. They use it as a maternity ward. And so what's interesting about this particular series of caves is that they have found within the cave system 114 other animals. Most of these are insects, invertebrates. 16 of them have not been found anywhere else on the planet, so are completely unique to this ecosystem. And so what they've determined is that the bat guano, bat poop, is kind of the engine of this system. And in fact, in some cases, they call it liquid sunshine because it's in the cave, deep in a cave. You don't have sunlight, right? So how do you get your energy source? Well, bat guano is a very rich source of energy. And there is a particular fungus that grows on the guano, and then you have a bunch of insects that eat the fungus. They are, and then in turn, eaten by other insects, cave crickets, spiders, and that grows the food web. So that's a really interesting and kind of unique system that biologists are studying in this particular series of caves. And bats also kind of, when we talked about this, or when I read about the relay system, bats then are another kind of capillary in this transport system, right? Because they're transporting some of these nutrients into these out-of-the-way places like caves, similar to the caves that you have here in South Dakota. Another example of this is tapirs in South America. So these are about 60 to 80 pound mammals, and it turns out that they are extremely key for distributing fruit, because they have evolved to eat the seeds of fruits. The seeds pass through their digestive system undisturbed, and they can then distribute them across the landscape. And in fact, many seeds have actually evolved for this very purpose. Okay, so the seeds that are, the fruits that are eaten by bears, for example, can be distributed this way. Tapirs, and even us. So one example of this is that in some restorative projects where they have used biosolids, which is basically treated poop, and used it to restore ecosystems, sometimes what they'll find the next year is tomato plants and melons sprouting because of the seeds that are still remaining in the soil. So this is nature's way of being able to regenerate, because if you think about it, what's better from the point of view of a plant, right? You're distributed in a new place and you've got your little packet of fertilizer right there with you, right? So from a plant's point of view, that makes perfect sense. But then the question is, so how do we fit into this whole cycle? And so part of the point that I make in the book is that we've kind of divorced ourselves from this kind of millennia cycle of recycling nutrients. So nature is very good at recycling water, at recycling phosphorus and nitrogen and other essential nutrients. So we're kind of the odd ones out and kind of, burying it or incinerating it. And so it's only recently that there's been kind of this rethinking of how do we use it wisely and safely in a way that we can basically extract the resources that we need. And so a lot of wastewater treatment plants have actually rebranded themselves as resource recovery facilities. So this is sort of this quiet revolution that's happening in the background. And so an example of that is that a lot of the plants have figured out how to extract phosphorus in the form of phosphorus pellets that you can then sell back as fertilizer. The problem with phosphorus and nitrogen is that if there's too much that is in the effluent that comes out of the wastewater treatment plant, it can be a pollutant. So we know that algal blooms, for example, which can kind of choke off waterways, happen because of excess nutrients, principally phosphorus, but also nitrogen. So one of the requirements in the United States is that treatment plants keep their levels of these pollutants below a certain point. And so what they have determined is they have the process now to basically extract it during the treatment process, thereby lowering the limit so it's no longer a pollutant, and then they can use it as an actual resource, selling it back to farmers, because we know that phosphorus is a limited element right now, and it's essential for plant growth. Okay, so you're basically taking what used to be a problem and you're turning it into a solution. Okay, so that's one example of it. Another example is in the rangelands of northern Colorado, similar to some of the rangelands here in the Dakotas. You have cattle, sheep, other grazers, and the problem is that over a period of time, they end up degrading the landscape, okay, because they're in herds, and so they tend to poop in one place. So the problem, so how do you help restore some of these rangelands and keep them from degrading and becoming places where they're turning into different habitats? Okay, so one of the ways that you can do that is you can actually use treated biosolids from us. So if you treat the biosolids and you can disperse them in a way where they are spread across the landscape and not in piles, they have actually, in northern Colorado, helped change the ecosystem so that for the grazers, they have created conditions that are amenable to the growth of edible plants like western wheatgrass and Indian ricegrass, instead of what the landscape was shifting towards, which was more of a desert, like a high plains desert, with prickly pear and ball cactus. And those are not as edible to cattle or to sheep. So you're basically trying to recreate what would have been the more free-ranging, herds of bison, for example, and other grazers who were changing the ecosystem or basically keeping it in this kind of cycle, intact cycle, by constantly being on the move, right? So it's this new idea of how do we work with nature instead of against it? And so that's another example of that. So I thought what I would do is maybe open it up for questions, if anyone has questions about this, and I can talk about some other examples. But if you have any questions about anything that I read from the book or anything else, yes?
Well, this isn't about anything I read in the book, but
Okay.
And I came in late, I apologize.
Okay, no problem.
What about methane? You know, these 4-chamber stomachs, they're blaming global warming on, everything, the oil boys, livestock. Can you talk about methane?
Absolutely. Yes, I would love to talk about methane. So there's actually a whole chapter on methane. So one of the other things that you can do with wastewater treatment plants is that you can capture a form of methane, biomethane gas. So we are all, or many of us, are methane producers. We have microbes in our gut that naturally produce methane as a result of their metabolism. Okay, so these are archaea bacteria, and they're specifically methane-producing archaea bacteria. Okay, so basically on YouTube, one of the demonstrations of this, which is a little disgusting but also kind of entertaining, is that people can basically light their flatulence on fire as a party trick. Okay, that is not something that I recommend because you can get hurt. But that is a demonstration of the fact that, yes, in fact, we can produce flammable gas. So the idea is, how do we use that instead of having it being released as a pollutant? Well, it turns out that in wastewater treatment plants, you have what are called biodigesters, and they basically mimic the conditions of the human gut. And so you have these microbes, these archaea, in the digesters. You feed in the waste, they chomp away on it, and one of the main byproducts is methane. And so basically what you're doing is taking naturally occurring methane, and instead of releasing it into the atmosphere, which would happen if you sent all of this to a landfill, because it would seep up as landfill gas and escape into the atmosphere. What you're doing is you're capturing it and you're using it. So it becomes a carbon neutral solution. You're taking what already was being produced and using it as fuel, as a replacement. So cattle are also big methane producers. But it turns out that you can also adjust what they eat to reduce the methane that they produce. So people are experimenting with different substrates in cattle feed. So seaweed, for example, is one. Different types of spices. And then actually charcoal. Charcoal can actually work really well to help change the gut, the microbiome of the cows, and actually absorb some of the methane. So there's actually really interesting studies that are going on now of how do you actually reduce the amount of methane that's going into the atmosphere naturally from cows, because cows are another big producer of methane. So a lot of this is happening. So it's basically a way of trying to shift what has been viewed as a problem, and how do we make it into a solution? All right. So that's just another example of some of the fun things that are happening at wastewater treatment plants that you never knew about.
Well, I was wondering, you talk about taking human waste and using it.
Yes.
Is there an easy way to do this? Is the wastewater treatment kind of set up, or
Yes.
is this a whole new thing we have to do?
No, we don't have to do anything. I mean, we're doing plenty. You know, I mean, we are the producers. This is not going to run out anytime soon, right? But what's happening in the wastewater treatment plants is, yes, they are shifting some of their equipment to produce this. And so there are different ways that you can do this. In Washington, D.C., there's a very large wastewater treatment plant. It's called Blue Plains. And what they do is they actually have this system. It's almost like pressure cookers that they use. The waste comes in, it's heated, so it's pasteurized. And then you use a pressure differential, and it basically sort of explodes everything, right? So what that means is it's pasteurized, it's safe. That slurry, basically, becomes the food substrate for the biogas, for the other microbes, because it makes it easier for them to get the nutrients. And then, as the solid product from that, you basically have what is a soil substrate. Completely pasteurized, completely safe. And then what they can do is compost that with other waste streams. So one of the things now that's happened is you have compost with wood shavings from the timber industry. And so you're creating this really rich, basically compost. And plants love it. So there's a big program in King County in Washington State, where I live. There are ones all over the country. Milorganite, if you know of milorganite from Milwaukee, which is an additive that you can use for plants, flowers, roses. That is also an example of this. It comes in pellet form, but that's been around for 80 years. So a lot of this has actually been going on, but now I think people are making more of an effort to sort of show what they can do. But the important thing is to test, because you have to convince people that it's safe, right? So there are very strict federal guidelines on a long list of elements of metals, and everything has to be below that, or else you can't use it. Yeah. But I mean, for plants, it's like instant garden. Yeah, so it's great.
If they do succeed in reducing the methane from cows, is anybody studying what that's going to do to the rangeland and the plants and animals that benefit?
Oh, that's an interesting question. The range, but basically the benefits that are coming to the rangelands would be coming from the nutrients themselves, not from the methane. So that would be more from like the phosphorus, the nitrogen, the calcium, potassium in their dung. So I don't think that the methane would, the levels of methane reduction would actually impact that, but it probably would alter their gut microbiome. And so that would be an interesting thing, is like, how is that altering that? And does that alter the range of nutrients, right, that they're delivering? So that would be an interesting thing, but the methane itself, reducing that wouldn't necessarily reduce the benefits to the rangeland. Yeah.
Is there any area that is using the methane gas from cows or from us to generate heat?
Yes.
Where?
There are biodigesters. So you can get a range of biodigesters. You can get a home-sized biodigester if you want, which basically can attach to your toilet. There are a lot of them on farms, specifically dairy farms. And then wastewater treatment plants would be another big place where they are. And so from the biogas, you can generate electricity, you can generate heat, you can even generate different fuels. So they've actually been experimenting with automotive fuels. And in some cases, even seeing if they can get it up to jet fuel. Because again, if you can create, the sort of the building blocks of the fuel, well then, you through different refinement processes, you can actually get up to different types of fuels. So in terms of where specifically, I can't say off the top of my head. I know that there are in North America. I know that there are a number of places in Europe and Australia that are doing this. And in fact, the biggest concentration of biodigesters now are in China. And so there's a lot of heat extraction from that as well. But oh, that's okay. Yeah.
So what about those eco toilets?
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about how they work relative to?
Yeah, the composting toilets.
Right.
Yes, so I have a whole chapter on composting toilets in the book. Good question. We didn't even plan this. So one of the fun examples in the book is there's a building in Seattle. It's called the Bullitt Center. And the Bullitt Center was built as a 6-story, basically a business center in the middle of Seattle, and one of the most self-sustaining buildings in the world. And so as part of that, they installed composting toilets because they wanted to be able to even reuse that. And so I won't spoil the end of it. There were interesting things that happened with that experiment. But the composting toilets maybe that you grew up with in some national parks that were kind of, smelly, those are long gone. The toilets now are very sophisticated. They're in a lot of actual universities and commercial buildings. And you would really have a hard time differentiating between those. The big difference is that they're connected to digesters. So again, it's kind of a small version of what you might find at a wastewater treatment plant. And typically they're filled with wood shavings. Some of them have worms. So they use vermicomposting is the name for that. And what happens is that over a period of months, everything is converted so that by the time you get to the bottom of the digester and they have little drawers that open up, you basically have soil. That can then be used for landscaping projects. Some places are using those to regenerate forests after forest fires. So that's another way of kind of giving back, to the soil. So because what happens after a forest fire is that you have not only a stripping of nutrients, but then the surface is drier and hotter. And basically this compost can lock in some of the moisture and reduce the temperature. So it helps heal. So yeah.
And how do they work with sub-zero temperatures?
Not as well. That's the caveat. Not as well. Yes, there is a limit. I mean, there are a number of ones in northern Minnesota. And in fact, in the book, I talk about a place in northern Minnesota that I visited where they're experimenting with different prototypes. But those are inside. You can't have that outside. So then the question is, how do you control the odor, right? which is very important if you're going to be living in the same space. And so there are ways that you can do that as well. So part of the whole process of experimenting is like, how do we make this easy to maintain, something that people want to have in their homes, and something that, you know, is going to be very easy at a certain, you know, time point. You're like, yep, it's ready. And then someone comes by, just like a septic system that you have. You know, eventually your septic system has to be serviced, right? So those people are already trained. So it would not be that much of a difference to instead have them be retrained for composting toilets. It's very similar. And in fact, a lot of the composting toilets are already serviced by septic folks. So, yeah.
Are there any problems with contaminants in human waste that then could accumulate over time?
Good question. Yes. So that is a concern. One of the chemicals that you may have heard about is PFAS, forever chemicals. One of the unfortunate realities is that PFAS now has contaminated pretty much everything, and including drinking water. And so that's a problem. I think my position on this is that when it appears in waste, it's sort of a fingerprint of our daily living, and that we should probably turn off the spigot at the source. Because, you know, you can say, well, yes, it's in here, but it's also in, you know, cosmetics, it's also in waterproof clothing, it's also in, you know, paper products, you know, so down the list. So yes, there are
Metals and things, heavy metals?
heavy metals. So that is a part of the requirement for testing. So lead, arsenic, other contaminants, absolutely. You cannot sell the product if the lead levels are above a certain threshold. And in fact, there is some interesting research on how for places that are contaminated with lead and arsenic, they have actually used biosolids to help decontaminate them. Because there are properties, physical properties, that can actually help bind up some of the metals and make them unavailable to plants. So that's a really interesting line of research as well. And it's that was a really counterintuitive thing that I discovered, was like, wait, you can actually use poop to help decontaminate land. But that research is emerging now, and so I talk about some of that in the book. But yes, you absolutely have to be very, very strict on the testing levels, and that is a problem. But I think for PFAS, you know, you're going to hear a lot more about that. But I think we really need to think about what's the upstream source, and how can we, you know, turn that off. Yeah. Yes.
I built wastewater treatment plants and fossil fuel generators for a living.
Okay.
I'd like to share a short story about the wastewater treatment plant engineering is exponentially getting so much better.
Mm-hmm.
But I built a few years ago for Warren Buffett. You know who Warren Buffett is, the richest guy in the world, is theoretically one of them.
Yep.
We built a fossil fuel generator, cost $3 billion, specifically for Google.
Okay.
Google and your smartphones suck massive amounts of energy. It was a Japanese design, and it had a scrubber on it which cleaned the effluent, you know, when it goes up the stack. Because I'd heard for days, 2 tons goes up the stack every day.
Okay.
But, you know, I couldn't see it, you know what I mean? So they brought in this scrubber, and I'm putting this thing in, and it looks like, it looks like sci-fi land. It was a huge electronic atomizer that when the exhaust came out, it magnified it. I'm using my terms.
Okay.
Electrified it.
Okay.
And then the sulfur dioxide would fall down into the vent, and the truck would haul it off.
Okay.
After 1 year, it buried downtown Deadwood by 300 foot. Did you hear that? Do you know what Deadwood looked like? Enough sulfur dioxide buried Deadwood 300 foot.
Okay.
They couldn't, what are you going to do with this stuff? They got me to sell it to the cement boys. Cement boys
so-
didn't want it.
I'm not familiar with that example, but
Well, here's what happened.
okay.
They
Do you
switched-
have a question on that?
They switched to natural gas completely. It was the Engineering News #1 design in the nation, Japanese design, squirrel cage burner.
Okay.
They couldn't handle the sulfur dioxide.
Okay. Well, I'm not familiar with that specific example. I think one of the things that is happening with wastewater treatment plants is that you're getting a back to nature approach, because the realization is that if you make it too complicated, then you end up with a lot of problems that you then have to solve. Right, so one of the things, and we'll talk about this actually tomorrow, we have a panel on conservation and how this fits into that. But one of the things that I think has really been interesting is centering microbes, because microbes are nature's engineers and degrading a lot of stuff. And in fact, even a lot of chemicals, antibiotics in the soil. So microbes can actually reduce a lot of that down to less harmful, less harmful substrates. So you're seeing a lot of that, but you're also seeing things like the mimicking of wetlands, because wetlands are nature's way of cleansing water. One of the ways in which you can filter water. So a lot of wastewater treatment plants now are mimicking how wetlands work and using kind of the filtration aspects of that. So you're using microbes, you're using filtration, you're using settling ponds where a lot of the particles can settle down, and that's similar to how nature does it. And then you're using aeration. So a lot of waterfalls, streams, where you've got your rush of water, that's how you actually introduce oxygen back to the water. And through the wastewater treatment process, a lot of times you're lowering the oxygen content. So how do you get that back? And so a lot of plants are now adding bubblers. Some of them are actually adding little waterfalls and features as part of this kind of more naturalized buffer. And so, again, it's sort of this realization that instead of a lot of the chemical processes that we were using that are, again, creating the issues of, okay, then how do you scrub that? How do you get rid of that? How do you store that? With a more natural process, you don't have some of those same issues. So that has been kind of another really interesting revolution. And in the process, what you're doing is you're actually creating habitat around some of these places as a buffer between the wastewater treatment plants and then where the water ends up. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. There's a panel tomorrow, but yeah, so that's another interesting way. I think we have time for maybe one more question. If anyone has any question, we're good? Yes.
Going back to your talk on bats.
Yes.
So I have followed this story very closely.
Yep.
Bats were starting to die from the fungus.
Yes.
One theory I heard it was from their own guano. True or false?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. I hadn't heard that. Let's see, white nose, yeah, fungus, yeah. Which, and I just want to clarify, that's different than the fungus that grows on the poop. So that's not related. But I don't know to what degree, like if there's been contamination from other sources that, because fungus, obviously there's a huge variety, right? And some are good and some are bad, depending on that. But yeah, I don't know that particular, I'm sorry. But that's, yeah, it's an interesting thing. And it's actually another, I think, reason for us to care about conservation, because bats are really important ecosystem engineers, and they're being wiped out, by this white nose fungus. So, yeah, it's a sad story. Yeah. Great, thank you. Thanks, everyone.